Today we are going to be reading A Brave Soldier by Nicolas Debon. This is a fictional story that is based in the time of World War I and when it was starting. And it's going to give us a mental picture of what it was like back in the day when Americans were going into the war. And so let's get started today. A Brave Soldier by Nicolas Debon. Frank was on his way home one evening in August when he heard a loud noise in the distance. A few blocks ahead, he came upon a crowd of men shouting, waving flags and beating drums. "War! War! Canada is at war!" His older friend Michael was in the crowd. "Frankie, come and join up," he called. "Let's go whip the Germans. It'll be easy and we'll be home by Christmas." Frank didn't know anything about the war or about Germans. He enlisted in the army because he didn't want anyone to think that he was a coward. When it came time for the platoon to leave, the whole town gathered at the station. The band often interrupted the mayor's farewell speech. The blast from the steam whistles made Frank jump. His mother cried a little and waved her white handkerchief when the train left. But Michael's sweetheart blew kisses and ran along the tracks. "Take care," called the fathers. It was October by the time Frank and his platoon mates were ready to board the huge ship that would take them across the Atlantic Ocean to Europe. Every nook and cranny of the boat was piled with equipment. Guns, cases of ammunition, horses, and food rations had to be stowed, and the men squeezed into any leftover spaces. On deck, a group of soldiers formed around Michael. As always, he was telling jokes and making fun of their commanders, or scary Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany. Frank had to laugh, but inside he felt a little afraid. 10 days later, the convoy reached England, where Frank spent the whole winter and rainy spring in a training camp. Frank was almost relieved when the order came to cross the English Channel for the battlefront. When they reached France, the soldiers were packed into a long line of trucks, which drove slowly over muddy roads. Stopping and starting, it took forever before Frank and his companions were finally dropped off near a ruined town. As the platoon marched in silence to the battlefront, the booming of artillery could be heard in the distance. An endless column of horse-drawn wagons, ambulances, and French soldiers, their blue uniforms covered in mud, was coming the other way. "How is it up there?" asked Michael. "It's terrible. It's like hell," replied a tall African soldier. "Where are you from?" "Canada." A scout guided them through a maze of deep ditches to the front line. The mud made everything dirty and slippery, but the worst was the terrible stench that filled the air. Across an empty patch of ground called No Man's Land lay the Germans' trenches, hidden behind piles of tangled barbed wire. The scout told Frank that at night he would be able to hear the Germans talking. They were so close. Slowly, Frank became used to his new life. All the soldiers had to carry water and food rations, make repairs to the trenches, and take turns keeping watch for enemy raids. Whenever Frank had free time, and he wasn't trying to snatch a few hours of sleep, he read, wrote letters to his parents, and played cards. Michael loved talking about the baseball team back home, of which he'd been the captain. While he listened, Frank worked on getting rid of the lice that infested his clothes and hair and made him itch. One afternoon, an officer came up. "We have received orders from headquarters. We will attack tomorrow morning," he said. "Good luck, boys." He tapped Frank on the shoulder and left. In the middle of the night, Frank heard heavy guns firing from behind him. The ground was shaking, and the sky was lit up behind enemy lines as though it were day. For the first time, Frank thought about the Germans over there. He wondered if they had also had homes and families waiting for them in Germany. This gave him a strange, disagreeable feeling. The bombing stopped. Frank and his platoon mates stood side by side on the fire step of the trench. Shivering in the cold night, no one dared to say a word. "Now!" called an officer who had been looking at his watch. Whistles blew. One by one, the soldiers climbed over the parapet and slowly moved out over no man's land toward the Germans. They had just reached enemy lines when shells started bursting around them. Frank saw the man next to him fall, shot by a machine gun. He was scared. He shouted as loudly as he could, but he couldn't hear his voice over the deafening noise. There was silence when Frank woke up. He had a terrible pain in his leg. He could not move, and he felt thirsty and cold. He looked around and saw that he was lying in a hole that had been made by a huge cannon shell. Beside him, drowning in the mud as he was, lay soldiers whose faces he could not make out. He couldn't even tell if they were dead or alive. After a moment, he heard voices speaking in German. 2 soldiers were walking toward him. Frank was terrified. He was sure they were coming to kill him. He tried to play dead, but one of the soldiers came closer. "Comrade, comrade, we mean no harm," said the man in a soft voice. "We are prisoners of war, helping to bring in the wounded." The stretcher bearers took him to a dressing station where dozens of soldiers were lying side by side. Some of the wounded were wearing German uniforms. Many men were missing arms or legs. He had a hole where his mouth used to be. One had a hole where his mouth used to be. Frank noticed that some men just lay shaking or whimpering over and over. But no matter where Frank turned, he could not find Michael. "You have shrapnel in your leg. You'll be lucky to keep it," said a doctor. "I'm afraid the war is over for you, kid." Frank was recovering when he learned on November 11th, 1918, that the war had ended, 4 years after it had begun. The last thing he did before taking the ship home to Canada was to visit the military cemetery where Michael was buried. Frank thought about his friend and about the young Germans whose voices he used to hear on the other side of no man's land. He wondered what had happened to them. The cold winter wind made him shiver. The end.